An arrogant executive spilled his coffee on purpose, expecting the cleaning lady to kneel. He never imagined that days later, she'd be the one deciding his fate. The morning light streamed through the tall glass windows of Whitmore & Co., a towering corporate empire in the heart of the city. The air buzzed with the sound of hurried footsteps, ringing phones, and the low hum of conversations between sharply dressed professionals. Men in tailored suits and women in designer blouses moved with an air of importance, briefcases in hand, coffee cups balanced precariously as they rushed to their desks. And in the midst of it all, Ruth Parker moved silently. She wasn't clad in an expensive blazer or polished shoes. Instead, she wore a simple blue janitor's uniform, her feet clad in sturdy black work shoes, and in her gloved hands, she held a mop. She had been here for years, long enough to know every face, every office drama, every whispered secret behind the glass walls of the executive boardrooms. But to them, she was invisible, just another part of the background, a fixture of the office like the coffee machine or the water cooler. As she moved between the cubicles, wiping down desks and emptying trash bins, she could hear them whispering. She always could. "Do you think she's been here longer than the CEO?" One young intern chuckled to his colleague, eyeing Ruth as she cleaned. "Probably," the other snickered, "and yet still scrubbing floors." Ruth didn't react. She never did. She simply wiped the desk, adjusted the chair, and moved on. But then Ethan Reynolds spoke. Ethan was one of the rising stars in the company, a young executive with a cocky grin, a Rolex watch, and the belief that he was destined for greatness. He barely glanced at Ruth as he leaned back in his chair, arms folded behind his head, his voice dripping with condescension. "Imagine working here for years and never making it past the cleaning crew." Laughter erupted from the surrounding desks. Ethan smirked, clearly proud of himself, while others exchanged amused glances. Ruth paused. Just for a second, then ever so slowly she turned her head and smiled, a knowing, almost amused expression that made Ethan falter for a brief moment. But she said nothing. Instead, she adjusted the cloth in her hands, gave a polite nod, and moved onto the next desk, as if his words didn't matter, as if she knew something they didn't. And in that moment, Ethan and the others had no idea. Today would be the day everything changed. The world of Whitmore & Co. operated on a hierarchy of power. It was a place where status mattered more than skill, where people measured worth by the cut of your suit, the brand of your watch, and the title on your office door. In this world, Ruth Parker was invisible. For over a decade, she had moved through the corridors, watching, listening, learning. She saw the rise and fall of executives, the desperate politics of promotions, and the quiet backstabbing that happened when no one thought they were being watched. She had wiped the tears of secretaries who were overworked and underpaid. She had heard the whispers of betrayals behind closed doors. She had seen the desperate ambition in the eyes of men like Ethan Reynolds, the ones who thought power made them untouchable. But Ruth? She wasn't just a cleaning lady. Ethan had everything. The looks, the charm, and the arrogance of a man who had never faced real hardship. His father's connections had secured him a position at Whitmore & Co., and his natural charisma had helped him climb the ranks faster than most. But Ethan didn't just want power. He expected it, and he had no patience for anyone beneath him, especially Ruth. To him, she was just a background character in his world, a woman who existed only to scrub floors and empty trash bins. He never noticed the sharpness in her eyes, the way she observed everything, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the way people treated her. In Ethan's mind, the company was his playground. And Ruth? She was nothing. There was only one person in the company who outranked Ethan, Mr. Reynolds, the CEO. No one really knew Mr. Reynolds. He was a legend, a ghost, a man who rarely appeared but controlled everything. His office on the top floor was practically a myth. No one entered unless summoned, and no one knew what he thought, what he planned, or what his next move would be. The employees feared him, but Ethan saw him as a stepping stone. He believed it was only a matter of time before He claimed the throne for himself. What Ethan didn't know was that Ruth knew Mr. Reynolds far better than he ever would. The company thrived on competition, ego, and ruthlessness. Promotions weren't given, they were taken. Colleagues weren't allies, they were obstacles. And the cleaning lady? She was a joke. They walked past her every day, their voices dripping with casual cruelty. I bet she doesn't even have a high school diploma. She's probably been here so long she thinks she owns the place. If I ever end up like that, just shoot me. Ruth heard it all. But she never reacted. Never corrected them. Never told them what she knew. Because she was waiting. Waiting for the day they'd finally see her for who she really was. It started like any other day at Whitmore & Co. The air buzzing with the sound of polished shoes clicking against marble. Floors, hushed conversations about deals being closed, and the constant hum of power and ambition filling the office. Ruth moved quietly through the space as she always did, her hands busy yet her mind sharp. She had seen this office at its best and worst, its celebrations, its betrayals, its fleeting alliances. And she had seen men like Ethan Reynolds before, arrogant, entitled, careless. But today, Ethan was feeling particularly cruel. He stood near the break room. His usual circle of admirers gathered around him, junior executives desperate for his approval, laughing at every joke, nodding at every boast. Ethan thrived on their attention, feeding off their admiration. And then he saw Ruth, an opportunity. With an exaggerated motion, he tilted his coffee cup, letting the steaming liquid spill onto the pristine floor right in front of her. Splat. Thuis. Rich brown stain spread like an ugly wound on the marble tile. The laughter that followed was sharp and mocking. Ethan smirked, tilting his head as if examining his own work. "Oops," he said, voice thick with fake remorse. "Clean that up, won't you?" The office fell silent, watching. Ruth paused. For the first time, she hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of something else. A flicker of something deep. Something far more powerful than anger. But she said nothing. Without a word, she bent down, her fingers gripping the rag a little tighter than usual. She wiped the mess with the same precision and patience she had used for years. Ethan watched her, amused at his own cruelty. And then, under his breath, but loud enough for everyone to hear, he muttered, "People like her will never be more than this." A few quiet gasps filled the space. Even among those who usually laughed along with Ethan, some were uncomfortable now. Ruth's hands stilled. She lifted her head slowly, locking eyes with Ethan. And for the first time, she spoke back. Her voice was calm, measured. "You might want to remember those words." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. The confidence in her voice unnerved him, but he brushed it off with a smug chuckle. To him, she was just a cleaning lady. What could she possibly do? But what Ethan didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Ruth's time had finally come. The next morning, the air inside Whitmore & Co. felt different. Something was off. The usual rhythm of the office, the clicking of heels, the hum of printers, the low murmur of meetings, had been replaced by whispers. Conversations weren't about the latest deals or client acquisitions. Instead, they were hushed, urgent, and then the news dropped like a bomb. No warning, no official memo, just a swift, unexpected exit. Employees huddled in small groups trying to make sense of it. Did he get fired? Did something happen? Maybe he finally cashed out and ran to some private island. No one had answers. But one thing was certain. A power vacuum had been created. In the executive lounge, Ethan lounged back in his chair, arms spread wide, a smug grin plastered across his face. He sipped his overpriced espresso, basking in the moment. "This is it, boys," he said, flashing a cocky smirk to his colleagues. "With the old man gone, one of us is getting promoted." A chorus of agreement followed. "Probably you, Ethan." "Yeah, I mean, you're basically running the place anyway." "No way they bring in an outsider." Ethan chuckled, as if the idea of someone else taking over was too ridiculous to even consider. But then a sharp knock echoed through the room. Heads turned as the HR director, Ms. Caldwell, stepped inside. She was a woman who never wasted words, never cracked a smile, and today her face was more unreadable than ever. "Attention, everyone," she called out. The murmurs died instantly. "As you've all heard, Mr. Whitmore has stepped down as CEO. Effective immediately, the company is under new ownership." A ripple of excitement ran through the crowd. Ethan straightened in his seat, his chest puffing out slightly. Here it comes. The announcement he'd been waiting for. The new owner will be making an appearance shortly. A brief silence. Then the questions came flooding in. Who is it? Did the board sell the company? Are we merging with another firm? But Ms. Caldwell didn't answer. She simply looked around the room, her gaze sharp, almost knowing. And then, with a slow, deliberate voice, she said, "I suggest you all prepare yourselves." The unease thickened. Ethan, still grinning, waved a dismissive hand. "Relax, guys. It's probably just some old investor." He had no idea how wrong he was. The tension in the office was palpable. The murmurs had died down. The tapping of keyboards had ceased. All eyes were fixed on the massive oak doors at the front of the conference room. Then, they swung open, and in walked Ruth. But not the Ruth they thought they knew. She wasn't in her janitor's uniform. There was no mop, no cart, no gloves. Instead, she wore a perfectly tailored deep navy business suit, her hair swept into an elegant bun. A delicate but powerful pearl necklace rested against her collarbone. She walked with quiet confidence, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The air shifted. People blinked. A few exchanged confused glances. And then, complete silence. Ethan's smirk vanished instantly. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like he had just seen a ghost. His breath caught in his throat. One of his colleagues whispered, "Wait, what the hell is going on?" Ruth reached the front of the room and turned to face them all. She didn't need to raise her voice. "Good morning." Her tone was smooth, even, controlled. "I see some familiar faces." Nobody moved. It was as if time itself had frozen. Then, with an almost amused glint in her eyes, she continued, "For years, many of you have walked past me without a second thought. Some of you were polite, others," she let her gaze linger on Ethan, "were not." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. She smiled, not cruelly, but knowingly. "Let me introduce myself properly." She took a slow step forward. "My name is Ruth Sinclair, and as of this morning, I am the CEO and majority shareholder of Whitmore & Co." A gasp rippled through the room. Someone audibly choked on their coffee. A junior executive dropped his pen. Ethan's hands curled into fists on the table, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he might crack a tooth. "No, that's impossible." His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but Ruth wasn't finished. "You see," she continued, "I was never just a cleaning lady. I was a silent partner in this company. I have owned the majority shares for over 5 years." Another round of shocked murmurs. Ethan gripped the armrests of his chair. "This has to be a joke." Ruth tilted her head slightly, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Dead silence. The weight of her words settled. Over the room, suffocating. Every cruel remark, every dismissive glance, every moment of disrespect, now laid bare. And Ethan, the arrogant executive who once mocked her, now sat frozen, powerless in his seat. The silence stretched, suffocating and absolute. Ethan's throat went dry. His heart pounded against his ribcage. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to move, to do something. But he sat frozen, gripping the armrests of his chair as if they were the only thing keeping him grounded. "This must be a joke." His voice wavered, barely above a whisper. Ruth's expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes. Not cruelty, not anger, but power. She took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The soft click of her heels on the polished marble floor sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood. "A joke?" She tilted her head slightly. "No, Ethan. What's funny is how confidently you spoke about people like me." Ethan flinched. The entire room held its breath. Ruth stopped just a foot away from him, her presence towering over him. Not in size, but in authority. In control. "Do you remember what you told me?" she asked, her voice even. "You said people like me would never be more than this." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wished he could disappear. She let the words linger, letting the weight of them sink in. Then she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough that only he could hear. "And yet, here we are. I'm the one deciding your future." A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. The irony crashed down on him with merciless force. For years he had mocked her, belittled her, seen her as nothing but an invisible worker beneath his notice. But now, she wasn't just above him. She owned the very company he worked for. The power dynamic had shifted so drastically, so completely, that it felt like a cruel twist of fate. The entire office watched, wide-eyed, waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't mean," Ruth simply smiled. "Oh, I know exactly what you meant." She turned away from him, addressing the rest of the staff. "Change is coming to this company." Her gaze swept the room, landing on those who had once looked down on her. And those who can't respect others? Well, let's just say they may need to look elsewhere. Ethan felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just karma, this was justice. The room remained deathly silent. Ethan sat stiffly in his chair, his face pale, his fingers trembling slightly as he tried to process what had just happened. His entire world had been flipped upside down in a matter of seconds. Ruth took one last glance around the office. The same space where she had once been invisible, where people had smirked at her presence, dismissed her, and mocked her behind her back. Not anymore. She inhaled deeply, steady and composed. Then she turned to Ethan, who was still struggling to find words. "I'm not going to fire you." Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, relief flickering in his eyes. But before he could exhale, Ruth continued. "But you're no longer an executive." His head snapped up. "Wait, what?" The murmurs in the room grew louder. A few employees exchanged, knowing glances, some smirking, others looking shocked. Ruth remained firm. "You'll start over in an entry-level position. You will earn your place, not because of privilege or arrogance, but through real work." Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. His mind raced for an argument, but nothing came. He had spent years looking down on people like her. Now he would be one of them. He glanced at his colleagues, but no one rushed to his defense. For years they had laughed with him, encouraged him, enabled him. But now, they avoided his gaze. They had seen the truth. Ruth straightened, addressing the entire office. "This company is going to change. From now on, no one will be treated as less than because of their position. Because real power, true power, isn't about titles. It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching." A hush fell over the room. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. One by one, employees began nodding. Some with respect, others with quiet guilt. They had been part of the culture that let Ethan thrive. But now, everything was different. As Ruth turned toward her new office, the one that had once belonged to men who had never even glanced at her, she walked with confidence, with purpose. Behind her, Ethan sat still, his once arrogant expression replaced with the harsh sting of reality. This was no longer his world, and Ruth? She was exactly where she belonged. The office had never felt so quiet, not even during late nights when the cubicles stood empty, humming with the faint glow of computer screens in standby mode. But now the silence felt different. Ethan sat stiffly in his new chair, a standard, uncomfortable swivel seat tucked inside a cramped cubicle. Gone were the days of his corner office, his leather chair, his executive desk with a view. He glanced at the desk before him, bare except for a stack of files and a company-issued notepad. No nameplate, no personal assistant, just work, real work, something he had scoffed at for years. He had been given a second chance, but the weight of his past words clung to him like chains. People like her will never be more than this. The Irony burned. Across the office, through the glass walls that separated status from struggle, Ruth sat at her new desk, the CEO's desk. She gazed out the window, not with triumph, not with revenge in her heart, but with a quiet satisfaction. This moment, this shift in power, was never about proving something to people like Ethan. It was about proving something to herself. She had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, treated as less than. And yet, here she was. The camera lingers. Ethan, lowering his head in realization, Ruth standing tall in quiet dignity. Then the final words echo. You never know who is watching. You never know who holds the real power. And those who judge too quickly, they always learn the hard way.